It's good to see everybody. So I will be talking about Newham, and I'm in sunny Newham right now. And I have given this talk the title "Volunteering as Infrastructuring, Citizenship, Empowerment, and Synchronicity." So again, the call is for the breakout groups afterwards. Anybody who is interested in discussing things related to volunteering, anything I'm going to be talking about, feel free to join that conversation. And as many of you are probably aware, Newham is a borough in the East End of London, and it has a long history of migration. And as Suzanne said, we're very much looking at it as, within this project, as an arrival neighborhood. But instead of like presenting facts and kind of like stats about the borough, I'd rather get straight into it and talk about this specific aspect, which is volunteering. My focus on volunteering doesn't mean that volunteering is any less or more important in Newham than it is in any of the other two sites. But it's rather that it is an aspect that has shaped my own ethnographic engagement with the neighborhood. I am a volunteer myself, as you can see in this lovely picture there. And I help with the weekly running of a food bank. And I also teach English classes at the same community center, and also at a primary school and also at a church. And so kind of like volunteering has kind of been part and parcel, sorry the pun, of my own fieldwork experience, and was quite fundamental in kind of like negotiating access to the field site. And through volunteering is how I became part of these different initiatives that work directly with newly arrived populations in the borough. But I think not only methodologically, I think volunteering equally also contributes to our project's exploration of arrival infrastructures. So that's what I'm trying to tease out in this presentation here, is to propose volunteering as infrastructuring, and taking into account these community organizations that I will be talking about as part of larger arrival infrastructures in the borough, right? And I also hope to tease out how volunteering actually forms part of arriving itself by looking at the role it plays in the arrival process, right? But before starting, I would like to briefly summarize a couple of academic discourses that I found really helpful when thinking about volunteering. So the first one is volunteering as reciprocity, and that seems to be kind of like an old anthropological concept, and I think there's a large body of literature that engages in volunteering as this like give and take. And I think that very much reflects also a lot of the language that you can find on the ground, so among volunteer organizations and volunteer coordinators. And yes, on a superficial level, there is a give happening and a take, but I think we can quite quickly move beyond these simplistic ideas of volunteering as a one-way street and rather look at the flows that are actually taking place within this transactional network, right? Within this transactional framework. So if we look at volunteering through the lens then of reciprocity, but also through the lens of labor, we can see how a variety of strictly non-monetary functions of work and labor can actually be pursued in volunteering, right? And the emphasis is obviously here on non-monetary. So the four that I found resonate most with my experience, my ethnographic experience, is first like volunteering as a framework to arrange time. So kind of like a certain rhythm of life. So a life being synchronous with those in the labor market, specifically for those volunteers who are excluded from the labor market in one way or another, be that migration status related or not. The second one is kind of like a sense of achievement and being useful, contributing to society, and a form of civic participation. I'll talk more about that in a second. The third one is that formal volunteering also provides social recognition in form of certificates, and that acknowledges kind of like the social significance of volunteers' work. And that can also become quite important in, you know, certain like asylum hearings or other dealings that have to do with immigration. And then a fourth one is kind of like a spiritual or divine rewards that specifically, I guess, take place when volunteering happens in a religious context. But that all sounds kind of, you know, nice. So there is also, when we look at volunteering through the lens of labor, there's also some rather critical takes, and specifically Martina Tazzioli I found really helpful here, who sort of like conceptualizes volunteering as unwaged labor and sees it through the lens of kind of like feminist scholarship. And she specifically talks about people who live in UNHCR camps, and where these camp residents are being prompted to volunteer their time to participate in workshops around the camp's organization. And for that, she suggests the term participatory confinement, kind of like stressing the point that people in the asylum system and living in these camps are actually participating in their own governance. And I think that's already quite relevant to what I want to explore. And then a second kind of like thematic focus is volunteering and citizenship. So kind of like understanding volunteering as civic participation and as a site where the relationships between the individual and the state are being negotiated and contested. And specifically these two works here by Katrin Kreml, 2022, and Rachel Humphreys, 2019, I found really helpful. So just to quickly engage with that, the main argument Katrin Kreml makes is she deals with asylum volunteers in rural Austria who take this call for civic participation serious and even one step further than maybe anticipated by the nation state. So they grant rejected asylum seekers something they call municipal asylum. So that's kind of like an informal asylum that they grant them. And she describes how volunteers, these are volunteers from kind of like what is perceived as mainstream society, actually become estranged from the nation state rather than becoming more part of it, and are actually contesting certain policies, but take it serious that they as volunteers can actually shape migration policies on the ground in their locality. And then Rachel Humphreys, this is something that's very relevant to Newham. She describes how in downscaled areas of the UK, volunteers fill gaps in social welfare provision. And all of a sudden in that scenario, the relationship between volunteers and service users gains of importance to determine what support looks like, or if support is given at all. And within these relationships, you have all kinds of moral judgments that have a lot to do with the volunteers' motivation to volunteer in the first place, that come into play and that play out in these relationships. So I think these are quite interesting ideas that sort of like serve as the foundation for my own thinking on volunteering here. But what I'm interested in is actually what happens when volunteering is carried out by people who are themselves in precarious migration situations. So I'd like to engage with a couple of things here that are happening around this community center. So the first is the story of one of my interlocutors. He goes by the name of Martin. So Martin and I, we met at the food bank where we both volunteer, and we kind of like started around the same time, and we took the general volunteer training together. His role is with a program that the organization calls the Digital Inclusion Hub. So that means he sets up a couple of computers during these food bank hours. So there's a food bank going on in the background, which you can see on the pictures here. And then he helps people at this desk to fill out digital forms or other computer related tasks. And he also kind of like became an unofficial Arabic interpreter for all kinds of things that are going on in the center. So the two of us, we are on friendly terms, and we occasionally also hang out outside of the volunteering hours. And one day I asked him if I could conduct a formal interview, and he agreed to that. So we sat down and we talked about all kinds of things, about his accommodation first in Newham, then he was moved out of the borough and then comes back to Newham to volunteer. But then we came to the topic of ESOL, so English classes, and he told me that he had lots of difficulties for the classes, to enroll on these classes when he first arrived. And he said, it was almost impossible for me because I didn't have my ARC, that's the asylum registration card that asylum seekers use as an ID in the UK, until many months later. And the college didn't accept any of the other papers that I was using as an ID, so I just had to leave it. I was quite surprised, and I said, you never went to English classes in the end? So he replied, no, I just did some self-studying in my room. I was perplexed, and I couldn't stop thinking about the number of people that I've seen being enrolled by Martin in his role as a volunteer on these English classes at the organization. Yet when he first arrived, he wasn't able to enroll. And the same goes for many other aspects of life with which he helps people at the Digital Inclusion Hub, be those forms of welfare benefits, so forms for welfare benefits, any dealings with the job centers, applications for higher education courses. Martin is excluded from accessing all of these due to his asylum seeker status, yet he helps others to access them on a regular basis. So then I asked Martin how he feels about it, and he simply replied, I mean, in a way, volunteering distracts you from the fact that you also need help, but you just try to feel like you live a normal life. That's it. And a second bit of ethnography that I would like to read out is, so in spring 2022, I'm entering the red brick church building that houses this community center. I've been volunteering here for over 6 months and have gained a lot of experience about its procedures, benefits, but also its shortcomings. My volunteer role is that of an assessor, which means that I conduct short interviews with new food bank users to find out about their situation and establish whether they're eligible for the food bank or not. There has been some frustration recently among the assessor volunteers since the workload seems too much and the responsibility of the role too high. So volunteers have been specifically unclear about the criteria of eligibility for the food bank support, which seems to reflect wider confusions among the paid members of staff. Today, another training takes place where new rules regarding the initial assessments are being communicated. So we sit down in one of the classrooms with the volunteer coordinator and the person in charge of the migrant advice services. After a couple of rounds of hello and how are you, we get to the topic of eligibility. The volunteer coordinator is very keen to stress that what we're doing is not interviewing or scrutinizing people in their situation, but that we rather assess needs and try to help them. We're not detectives, she says jokingly. The migrant advice coordinator nods, then it's her time to talk, and she starts by saying that we need to be stricter and ask people to see proofs of their benefits or income, or proofs that they have no recourse to public funds. There's some concern among the volunteer assessors who share their own stories about how hard it is to obtain a proof of anything in this country, especially when one is in an unstable or precarious immigration situation. The conversation is diverted when one of the volunteers shares a story about how they found out about the ineligibility of a service user. This triggers a whole cascade of anecdotes told by other volunteers and the migrant advice coordinator. One story is about how a service user was showing a bank statement as proof of address with a high sum of money being noted in that person's savings account. Another story tells of how someone found out through personal context that someone who was accessing the food bank for months was indeed the owner of not one, but two properties in the area and was renting them to another service user. The migrant advice coordinator stresses again how important it is to find out who is eligible and who is not, since the food bank donations we receive are getting less and less, and she wants to make sure that the support is given to the ones that most need it. That's why it's important to thoroughly look at each case when we do the assessment, she says, to which one of the volunteers, who herself has an asylum case pending, responds, yes, like a detective. I say that I feel a bit uncomfortable about making the final decision about someone receiving support or not as a volunteer, to which the migration advice coordinator responds that I should not think of myself as a volunteer, but rather as someone who is a central part of the organization, and that she has all the trust that I will make the right decision. Just trust your gut feelings, she says, before we conclude the training. I call this conclusion, or rather some further incentives for thought, and I hope we can explore this a little bit more in the breakout groups. So what I've been trying to show throughout this presentation is how volunteering plays a crucial role in the context of arrival. So we have in Kreml and Humphreys, we have a description of how negotiations of citizenship take place through volunteering and in the relationship between the individual and state. So we can see how in the absence of state-run services, volunteers step in to fill the void. And Humphreys describes specifically how relationships between volunteers and service users, together with the moral judgments, become fundamental in determining what support looks like, or if support is given at all. But my question here is, what happens when volunteers are also service users? And what does that tell us about the complex negotiations around citizenship when they take place among people whose claim to civic participation are massively curtailed or right out rejected by the nation state? So what kind of conflicts and solidarities are produced through these negotiations is what I'm trying to think through in the next phase of this project. And to conclude, the two other aspects I would like to stress is, one is empowerment. So I think empowerment in this case is based exactly on that exchange between volunteers giving their time and being empowered in return, in this like reciprocal nature. But I think in development studies, the participatory turn and its specific undertones of empowerment have already been criticized for being based on a false understanding of power, kind of like power as an object that can simply be passed from one person to the next, when in reality, power is a much more complex process. And I think specifically this perspective speaks much more to the perspective of the institution and of this community center and their self-understanding as a participatory grassroots initiatives, which sets them apart from other initiatives that recruit their volunteers in a different way. So that's also something I would like to discuss more in the breakout group, hopefully. And the third one is about temporality and synchronicity. So precarious arrival means that one's life reality can feel distorted and out of sync with your own expectations, or also with the perceived rhythm of other people's lives. So I think in the example of Martin specifically, we can see how volunteering also serves as a tool to momentarily feel like one has arrived or settled. So that's all from me. Thank you.